How many of you know what a new nation problem is? Well, a new nation problem is a concept that has been developed by historians and possibly sociologists to talk about what happens when a colonial power has to desert the colony. The colony wins independence, is granted independence, is too expensive for the colonial power to maintain anymore. In this country, essentially, well, we had several. The obvious one was slavery. But there was also one that resulted in the Whiskey Rebellion. Ollie, have you learned about the Whiskey Rebellion yet? Okay.
George Washington had to go up there personally to stop it, but it already ended by handing out.
Right. Well, historian David Hackett Fisher, who wrote Albion's Seed, which is an extremely interesting book. It's a sociology of the 4 British regional cultures that settled the American colonies and their folkways, reads it like this: the Puritans of New England, the Quakers in the Delaware Valley, the distressed Cavaliers in the Virginia Tidewater and the Chesapeake Bay all got together and they wrote the Constitution. There was nobody at the Constitutional Convention to represent the interests of the 4th culture, which were the Scots-Irish to the back country. And at the time of the Revolution, you have to remember that 2/3 of North Carolina was back country. And about 15 years after the Declaration of Independence, they made their displeasure known and nearly scuttled the entire thing, the entire experiment, because their voices hadn't been heard in the first place. In ancient Rome, it's coincidentally at almost the same historical moment, about 15 years after they threw out the kings and had set up the Roman Republic, they had a new nation problem that presented itself. In fact, it presented itself no less than 5 times in 200 years. Sometimes it's referred to as the conflict of the orders. Ollie, you might have heard of the secession of the plebs.
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the first time it happened, there was a debt crisis. There was a war with the neighbors. There was always a war. Remember, these are the Romans we were talking about. And the patricians, the 10% or the 1%, decided that the debts that were incurred by the plebeians, who were everybody else, would be collected with full vigor. And the plebeians were not very happy about this. And what made matters worse was that a veteran army officer who had served with distinction for years had not been able to pay these ruinous debts. He had to sell off the family farm. And this wasn't supposed to happen. And the plebs were very upset about this. And eventually what ended up happening was they got up out of Rome one day and moved 3 miles to the next hill and stopped and set up a defensive perimeter and waited for the Senate to do something that would satisfy their demands, or at least grant them what they considered some degree of justice. Sort of like what we had recently in this country, when even though the enhanced unemployment benefits ran out, people didn't automatically run to go back to these horrible jobs that they had all hated before, that didn't pay them enough, and that expected full-time availability for part-time salary and no benefits. And at this point, the patrician order in Rome panicked, because who was going to do all the grunt work? So they got a fellow named Agrippa Menenius Lenatus. Lenatus you might recognize, because Lenatus is the Latin for woolly. It's the same root word as lanolin. Anyway, Agrippa Menenius Lenatus, he was a former consul, so in the first 10 years that Rome had been a republic, he had been one of the two leaders of that republic. Now, the standard histories from Rome say that only patricians were allowed to run things at that point. But he had plebeian ancestors somewhere. So the plebeians trusted him better than they trusted just about anybody else. It might be that he was descended from shepherds because of the name Lenatus. Anyway, he went out to see them. Well, he led a small delegation, either 3 people or 10 people, the sources differ, and he told them a fable, which was, once upon a time when the parts of the body were still independent of each other to some degree, all the rest of the body got tired of the belly, because the way they saw it, all the belly did was sit around all day. It took in the food, so it was the gravy job, literally. But it didn't really do much of anything, did it? So the hand says, well, I'm not going to lift up food to the mouth so that the belly can have it. The mouth says, I'm not going to chew food. I'm not going to swallow food. The teeth say I'm not going to chew food. And so on. And that lasted several days. And then a strange thing happened. All manner of unexpected and unintended consequences happened. The teeth had nothing to do. The mouth was dry and was hungry. And the limbs got to be too weak to do anything because the entire body was starving. And this apparently convinced the plebeians to send around a delegation to the Senate to try to come to terms. And although I will remark, possibly slightly cynically, that it's all very well and good for the 1% to send somebody around to tell everybody else how important their drab and boring lives were. But would their money be where their mouth was? And eventually, a series of reforms were enacted. The plebeians were given special officers of state called the tribunes, whose job it was to act as advocates for the entire plebeian class. And this happened 4 more times in the next 200 years. So the plebeians had a lot to be unhappy about. And so what does this have to do with church, you ask? This is the same story that Paul is referring to when he's talking about spiritual gifts. From the 12th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Now, concerning spiritual gifts, brethren, I do not want you to be uninformed. There are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. There are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of working, but the same God who inspires them all in every one. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are inspired by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, although many, are one body, so it is with Christ. By one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and were made to drink of one Spirit. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I don't belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would be the hearing? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the organs in the body, each one of them as he chose. And he goes on for a bit, but you get the point. There is a wonderful animated version of the Joseph story called Joseph, King of Dreams, which is sort of a prequel to the Prince of Egypt. And has one particular song in it that's really good. Well, we all remember the Joseph story. I mean, Joseph is a young man, a few years older than our Ollie is. And of course, he has what turn out to be prophetic dreams. Unfortunately, he is also an insufferable little know-it-all. And I mean, and his brothers finally get enough of him, and they sell him into slavery. I mean, I know it's politically incorrect to say that the slave is in any way responsible for being taken into slavery. Well, that objection would be true for people of African descent. I mean, they were on another continent just doing their thing, and along come the traders, some of some of whom were members of enemy African groups, and rounded them up and shipped them across the ocean and so on. We know the rest of that sad story. But Joseph did bring some of his problems on himself, because he had to learn the gift of family. He hadn't sufficiently appreciated it, and there's this wonderful song where his mother is trying to tell him this, and she says, there's room bloom, may you learn your gifts are meant to give away. I mean, think of how profound that statement is. Your gifts are meant to give away. And they're not meant to make you look better. They are meant to help other people. That took me a few years to learn the difference too, so I can sort of relate. When you grow up being one of the smartest people you know,
It's just a funny statement.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, especially when that's what you think you are. Of course, I knew a lot more going into college than I knew coming out of college. Because if college does its job, it teaches you the extent of your own ignorance.
It did its job.
Yeah, Lord have mercy, it did its job. And thank the Lord for that. But but Joseph does bring part of his own fate on himself. And when his brothers show up later, it's his wife who talks him down off the ledge, because he is still mad as a hornet because of what they did to him, and that's justifiable, but it doesn't help him move on. So in Quakerism, we have never been one for the flashy gifts so much. Speaking in tongues has never been that big a Quaker thing. Discernment, certainly prophecy. If you define prophecy as knowing and being able to articulate the will of God, yes. Helps, hospitality. Remember, Quakers didn't abolish the ministry. We abolished the laity. Yeah. Okay, we didn't abolish the clergy. We abolished the lay people. Nobody in Quakerism, we actually believe in the priesthood of all believers. What is your ministry? Yeah. So that's the question I leave with everybody. What gifts do you think you might have? And what use are you prepared to put them to help? Well, the evangelicals would say build the kingdom. The Jews might say repair the world. Jesus would probably say, shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. What are your gifts? What do you bring to the table? What are you prepared to put on the line?